The wind howled across the barren landscape of Drakor 3, carrying with it the eerie stillness of a world long abandoned. It was a planet that no one spoke of, a forgotten graveyard of ancient creatures and failed experiments. The sky above stretched into an endless void, its color an oppressive shade of deep indigo, unbroken by clouds or life. Elias Thorne had been to many forsaken places in the galaxy, but there was something different about this one. Something that made his gut twist with unease. The Aurora Dawn hummed softly as it hovered above the cracked terrain, its engines keeping it afloat while Elias scanned the surface below. His ship's sensors had picked up a life form, something small, something barely registering against the planet's dead atmosphere. At first he thought it was a glitch, but the signal persisted. A weak, flickering pulse. Not dead, but close. Elias adjusted his visor, narrowing the scan, his brow furrowing at the readings. It wasn't just small, it was too small. Drakor 3 was rumored to be a resting place for the great draconic species, beings of legend that had once ruled the skies with fire and fury. Their remains had been sought after by scavengers, their bones used in illegal black market augmentations. But this reading, it wasn't a corpse, it was something alive. "All right," Elias muttered, grabbing his pack and strapping his tools to his belt. "Let's see what's down there." Descending from the ship, he felt the cold bite of the wind against his skin. His boots crunched against the dry, cracked earth as he made his way toward the signal. The land stretched endlessly before him, a graveyard of giants, the skeletal remains of dragons long since passed littering the valley, their massive ribs jutting from the ground like the remnants of fallen gods. And then he saw it. At first, he thought it was just another carcass, another set of bones belonging to a long-dead beast. But as he stepped closer, he saw the slight, shuddering rise and fall of breath. Curled against the remains of a massive ribcage lay a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. A dragon, but small, far too small for what its kind was meant to be. Its body was covered in cobalt blue scales, dulled by dust and grime, thin, malnourished, scarred. Its wings were tucked close to its body, one of them bent at an unnatural angle, as if it had been broken long ago and left to heal improperly. The worst part was the clusters of barnacle-like parasites latched onto its skin, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. They pulsed, feeding, draining, suffocating. Elias had seen enough suffering in his lifetime to recognize a slow death when he saw one. The dragon stirred, a soft, pained growl escaping its throat. Its golden eyes flickered open, locking onto him. Even in its weakness, even in its suffering, there was defiance in that gaze. "Who are you?" The voice that reached him was hoarse, raw, the sound scraping against the silence like a blade against stone. Elias took a slow step closer, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Easy there, big guy. I'm not here to hurt you." The dragon huffed, its nostrils flaring weakly. "I am no big guy, human." There was a bitterness in its tone. Elias crouched down, his heart hammering as he took in the full sight of the creature before him. "You got a name?" A pause. The dragon's breathing was shallow, its golden eyes half-lidded. "Nixar," it murmured. Elias exhaled slowly. "All right, Nixar," he said, voice steady. "Let's get you out of here." Nixar didn't move, didn't even try. The dragon's body was heavy, too weak to do anything but watch Elias with quiet skepticism. The parasites had drained too much of its energy, and if Elias had to guess, it had been this way for a long time. "Why are you here, human?" Nixar's voice was a whisper, rasping with exhaustion. "No one comes to this world willingly." Elias pulled out his scanner, adjusting the settings to map the parasite's hold on the dragon's body. He frowned at the results. "These things are designed to suppress your strength," he muttered. "They weren't just feeding on you. They were keeping you weak." Nixar didn't respond immediately, its golden eyes flickering toward the ruins of ancient, long-dead dragons surrounding them. "My own kind did this," it admitted, the words filled with something heavy. Resignation. Elias stilled. He had suspected something cruel, but not this. "They left you here to die?" A bitter, weak chuckle. "They left me here because I am small. I am a disgrace to them. A dragon meant to be mighty, reduced to this." Elias clenched his jaw. He had seen prejudice in all its forms, species turning against their own for being too weak, too different, too not enough. But he had never expected it from creatures as revered as the dragons. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," he muttered. Nixar blinked, startled by his bluntness. Elias sighed, tossing his scanner aside and rolling up his sleeves. All right, first things first, we gotta get rid of these parasites before they suck the last bit of life out of you. The dragon narrowed its eyes. You think you can just remove them? Elias smirked, pulling a set of high-frequency laser scalpels from his tool belt. Trust me, he said, igniting the first blade, its edge humming with precise energy. I fix broken things for a living. Nixar watched as Elias got to work, his hands steady, his focus unwavering. For the first time in centuries, someone had come for the forsaken dragon. For the first time, Nixar dared to hope. Nixar's body trembled beneath Elias's careful hands. The parasites had dug deep, their tendrils wrapped around his nerves like creeping vines, draining him bit by bit, year after year. Elias had seen infections before, wounds left untreated, but nothing like this. These barnacle-like growths weren't natural. They had been placed here. Every cut of the laser scalpel sent a ripple of pain through Nixar's weakened form, but the dragon barely flinched. He held himself still, only his ragged breathing betraying how much it hurt. You okay? Elias muttered, glancing up as he worked. Nixar exhaled sharply. I have felt worse. That shouldn't have been comforting. Elias focused, guiding the laser precisely along the edges of one of the largest parasites, watching as its pulsating form recoiled under the blade's heat. The moment he severed its final tendril, the parasite let go violently, as if it knew it had lost. Nixar let out a sharp growl, muscles seizing from the sudden release. Elias didn't stop. One by one, he cut through the growths, watching as they shriveled and died, leaving deep, raw wounds beneath. His hands worked tirelessly, sweat forming on his brow despite the cold. The process took hours, each removal leaving Nixar a little freer, but also a little weaker from the strain. When he reached the final parasite, the largest one, clinging to the base of Nixar's skull, Elias hesitated. This one had dug the deepest, its energy still pulsing like a living, breathing thing. This one's the worst, Elias murmured. If I pull it too fast, it might. Nixar's golden eyes flickered open, looking at him with something Elias couldn't quite place. Trust. Do it, the dragon said simply. Elias took a breath, steadied his grip, and made the final cut. The parasite screamed not in sound, but in a violent surge of energy that lashed through Nixar's body like an electric current. The dragon howled, his body seizing violently as the last of the parasites died. For a terrifying moment, Elias thought he had pushed too far, taken too much. Then slowly, Nixar breathed again. The tension in his limbs eased, his golden eyes fluttering open, their glow stronger than before. His wings, weak and ragged, twitched at his sides, as if testing the feeling of movement again. Elias let out a slow breath, wiping his forehead. That was close. Nixar huffed, exhaustion evident. You did it. Elias sat back on the cold ground, looking at the pile of dead parasites beside them. Yeah, he muttered. I guess I did. For the first time in centuries, Nixar was free. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, the stars watching in silent witness as Nixar took his first true breath as a free dragon. He lay still, exhausted, his body adjusting to the absence of pain, the absence of the constant, soul-draining parasites that had kept him in chains. Elias remained by his side, arms crossed, scanning him carefully. The wounds left behind by the parasites were still raw, but they would heal. His energy would return, his strength would grow. But something else worried Elias. Nixar had been left here for a reason, and whoever had done it, they would want to keep him that way. Now what? Elias asked, his voice quieter than before. Nixar's golden eyes drifted toward the sky, a flicker of something distant, unreadable in his gaze. I don't know, Elias frowned. You don't have anywhere to go? Nixar let out a soft, bitter laugh. I was never meant to go anywhere. I was meant to be forgotten. Elias hated the way that sounded. Yeah, well, he said, pushing himself up and stretching his arms. Too bad for them. You're still here. Nixar turned his head slightly, studying him, curious, wary, intrigued. You do not fear me, Elias snorted. You're not exactly at your most terrifying right now. Nixar huffed, something almost amused flickering in his gaze. And yet, even weakened, even knowing what I am, you still chose to save me. Elias hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer that. Maybe it was because he had spent his whole life fixing things that others abandoned. Maybe it was because he had seen too many people thrown away by the powerful, discarded, like they didn't matter. Or maybe it was because, from the moment he saw Nixar lying there, struggling to breathe, something inside him had known. This dragon wasn't done yet. Elias sighed, shaking his head. Guess I don't like seeing good things wasted. Nixar stared at him for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then, slowly, he lifted himself onto his feet. Elias watched in quiet awe as the dragon stretched his wings, testing them, moving his limbs as if rediscovering the sensation of freedom. The wounds on his body still glowed faintly with the remnants of energy lost, but there was strength beneath the surface, waiting to be rekindled. Nixar tilted his head toward Elias, eyes gleaming. You saved me, human. Elias shrugged. Yeah, well, I'm a mechanic, it's what I do. Nixar let out a slow, deep exhale. Then, without another word, he turned toward the night sky, staring up at the stars that had once felt so impossibly out of reach. For the first time, he did not feel small. And for the first time, he was no longer alone. Nixar stood still, his golden eyes fixed on the vast sky above, where stars pulsed softly in the endless dark. His wings twitched at his sides, weak, uncertain. It had been so long since he had considered the possibility of flight, since he had thought of himself as something more than an exile in the dust. Elias watched him carefully, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had seen machines break before, had seen ships reduced to nothing but scraps and rust, their parts scattered across the void. But machines could be rebuilt. He had to wonder, could the same be done for a dragon? How do you feel? Elias finally asked, breaking the silence. Nixar let out a slow breath. Lighter. His tail shifted, curling slightly against the ground. Strange. Elias smirked. I imagine not being half-eaten alive by parasites would feel pretty good. Nixar shot him a dry look. Your humor is insufferable. Elias grinned. And yet, you're still standing here listening to it. The dragon huffed, but didn't argue. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the dust across the canyon floor. Elias watched as Nixar flexed his claws against the ground, his tail flicking as if testing his own balance. His body was still too thin, his muscles underdeveloped, his wings too stiff to stretch fully. It would take time for him to regain his strength, but he would. Elias had no doubt of that. You should try, Elias said after a moment. Nixar frowned. Try? Elias gestured toward his wings. To fly. A deep silence followed. Nixar exhaled sharply. You assume I can. Elias raised a brow. You're a dragon, aren't you? Nixar's gaze flickered with something unreadable, something heavy and unspoken. He turned his head slightly, glancing at his own wings as if they belonged to someone else, as if they were reminders of something lost, rather than something his own. I haven't flown in years, he admitted, voice quiet. Not since they left me here. Elias said nothing, waiting. Nixar let out a slow breath. He knew Elias wouldn't push, wouldn't demand, but he also knew the human wouldn't let him wallow in hesitation either. He had spent his entire life being told what he couldn't do, that he was too small, that he would never soar like his kin, that he wasn't enough. Perhaps it was time to prove them all wrong. Nixar lowered his body, claws digging into the earth as he spread his wings for the first time in what felt like centuries. The joints creaked in protest, stiff from years of neglect, but he ignored it. He focused, his breathing steady. The wind shifted beneath him, and then he leapt. His wings flared, catching the air, but the moment his feet left the ground, a sharp jolt of pain surged through his back. His body wobbled, his wings faltering, and in an instant he collapsed back to the earth. Dust erupted around him. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. He simply waited. Nixar growled under his breath, frustration burning in his golden eyes. He clenched his jaw, curling his claws against the dirt. Failure. And then Elias spoke. You got off the ground. Nixar froze, blinking. Elias shrugged. Might not have been for long, but it was something. Nixar looked down, his breathing slow, his wings still trembling slightly at his sides. He had expected mockery, disappointment, pity, but Elias's voice held none of those things, only certainty. You're not weak, Elias said simply. You're recovering. There's a difference. Nixar stared at him, something unspoken passing between them. And then, slowly, the dragon lifted his head. Perhaps, for the first time in his life, he believed it too. The fire crackled softly, sending orange embers swirling into the cold night air. Elias sat cross-legged near the flames, fiddling with a small transponder module, rewiring it carefully with a set of delicate tools. Nixar lay a short distance away, watching with a mixture of interest and subtle wariness. "What are you doing?" the dragon asked finally. Elias didn't look up, boosting a signal. Nixar's tail twitched. "For what?" Elias set his tool down, stretching his fingers before glancing at the dragon. "You ever heard of a distress beacon?" Nixar's gaze darkened slightly. "I have," Elias nodded. "Well, I'm sending one out." The dragon's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Elias sighed. "Because, Nixar, as much as I love camping out in dragon graveyards, I'm not planning on staying here forever. My ship needs repairs, and I'm guessing you wouldn't mind getting off this rock either." Nixar was silent for a long moment. His golden eyes flickered toward the twinkling void above them, the vast sky he had once thought would never belong to him again. He should have wanted this. He did want this. And yet, something about the way Elias had said it, so easily, so casually, as if it were nothing at all, made Nixar's chest tighten. "Who will hear it?" Nixar asked, his voice quieter now. Elias ran a final diagnostic check on the module, watching as a soft beacon pulse flashed from the small screen. "Anyone nearby," he said. "Traders, scavengers, maybe even a Federation patrol if we're lucky." Nixar exhaled slowly. "Or my kin." Elias didn't look up, but he didn't dismiss it either. "They abandoned you," Elias said carefully. "You really think they'd come back?" Nixar was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Yes." Elias finally met his gaze. "They wouldn't come to save me," Nixar continued, his voice like steel wrapped in flame. "They would come to make sure I was still buried here, to make sure I never became something they feared." Elias leaned back slightly, resting his arms against his knees. "Then we don't let that happen," Nixar huffed softly. "And how exactly do you plan to stop them, human?" Elias smirked. "Haven't you noticed yet?" He gestured vaguely between them. "I'm really good at fixing things. And right now you're the best damn thing I've ever worked on." The dragon blinked at him. And then, to Elias's surprise, Nixar let out a deep, rumbling chuckle. "Then you'd better work fast," he said, amusement flickering through his golden eyes. "Because once that signal reaches the wrong ears, we won't be fixing anything." Elias grinned. "Then let's make sure we're ready." The beacon pulsed again, sending its call into the endless dark. Somewhere, across the cold abyss of space, something was listening. And it was coming. The beacon pulsed. Across the cold emptiness of space, the signal traveled, reaching unseen ears, awakening those who had once believed their mistake had been buried forever. Nixar knew. He could feel it in his bones, in the shifting weight of the air around him. The galaxy had been far away for so long, its presence nothing more than a distant ache in his mind. But now, as he sat near the dwindling fire, listening to the quiet hum of Elias's repairs, he could sense them, his kin. They would come. Not out of guilt, not out of remorse. They would come to finish what they started. Elias was oblivious to the weight of it. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe he just didn't care. The human had been working all night, muttering curses under his breath as he reassembled a portion of his ship's engine interface, fingers smudged with grease, exhaustion clinging to his shoulders. Nixar had never met a creature quite like him, a human who had no reason to stay, but did anyway. "You should rest," Nixar said, his voice steady, watching Elias carefully. "Your body will give out before the ship does." Elias snorted but didn't look up. "I don't sleep much." Nixar tilted his head. "Why?" Elias hesitated, his hands stilled for half a second before continuing their careful work. "Old habits." A vague answer. One Nixar could have pushed for more, but he chose not to. Instead, he simply watched, taking in the quiet determination of the human who had saved him without question, without hesitation. Elias finally sighed, setting his tools aside, rubbing his temples. "Fine, I'll take a break." He shot Nixar a wry glance. "Happy?" Nixar huffed, tail flicking slightly. "Unlikely." Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "You really know how to make a guy feel appreciated." The moment of quiet didn't last. A sharp beep emitted from Elias's wrist console. Nixar immediately tensed. Elias frowned, tapping the device, reading the new data flashing across the screen. The beacon had been received. Multiple incoming ships. Elias exhaled through his teeth. That was fast. Nixar's muscles coiled, his wings flexing slightly, the ache still present but bearable. "How many?" Elias swiped through the readings, his face darkening. 3. 2 standard-class fighters. 1, larger. His gaze flickered toward Nixar. "I'm guessing we're not dealing with friendly traders." Nixar knew who it was before Elias even finished speaking. His kind, the ones who had left him to rot. His golden eyes burned, something ancient and unrelenting stirring in his chest. He was done hiding. "They're here for me," Nixar said simply. Elias studied him carefully, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly do they want?" Nixar's tail lashed against the ground, to erase their mistake. Elias exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. "Right?" He stood, stretching his arms, then shot Nixar a sideways glance. "Well, good thing I don't like following orders." Nixar tilted his head. "What does that mean?" Elias smirked. "It means they're not taking you anywhere." The dragon blinked, caught off guard. "You would fight for me?" Elias shrugged. "I've already put this much effort into keeping you alive. Would be a waste to lose you now." Nixar stared at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time in years, he smiled. A sharp, powerful gleam of teeth, the kind of smile a dragon made when he was ready for war. The ships descended like shadows against the twilight sky, their dark forms slicing through the air with a quiet, deadly grace. Nixar could feel them before he saw them, their presence a ghostly reminder of what he had once known, what had once been his own bloodline. Elias stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the ships land with an air of casual indifference that Nixar had come to recognize as deceptively calm. "They don't seem the let's talk this out type," Elias muttered. Nixar didn't look away from the approaching vessels. "They aren't." The ship doors hissed open, and from within stepped a dragon unlike Nixar. Larger, armored, powerful in a way that Nixar had never been allowed to be. His scales were obsidian black, his silver eyes sharp with authority and cruelty woven together in equal measure. Nixar's breath hitched. Varian. The one who had led the exile. The one who had called Nixar a stain upon the bloodline. Varian's eyes swept the desolate landscape, landing on Nixar with something akin to amusement. "So," he mused, his voice deep and calm, "the runt still breathes." Nixar held his ground, not for lack of trying. Varian stepped forward, his wings partially spread, a display of dominance, of unspoken superiority. "You should have died here," he said. "It would have been merciful." Nixar's claws flexed against the earth. "I don't need your mercy." Elias cleared his throat loudly, breaking the tension. "Hate to interrupt, but I feel like we're skipping a lot of the 'why are you here' part of this conversation." Varian's gaze flicked to Elias, taking him in for the first time. His expression barely shifted, but Nixar could feel the disgust behind it. "You involve yourself in matters beyond your kind, human," Varian said, his voice clipped. "This does not concern you." Elias snorted. "Yeah, well, see, I make my business when people try to kill my friends." Varian let out a low, sharp laugh. "Friends?" He turned his attention back to Nixar. "You would side with this lesser being?" Nixar did not hesitate. "Yes." Varian's expression darkened. "I should have ended you when you were first born," he said, voice colder now. "We thought exile would be enough, that you would disappear into the void, that time would take care of you." Nixar's golden eyes blazed. "I survived." Varian exhaled through his nose. "For now." He tilted his head. "But do you truly believe you can defy your own bloodline? That this," he gestured vaguely at Elias, at the abandoned landscape around them, "means anything?" Elias muttered under his breath. "Wow, he's got a whole monologue prepared, huh?" Nixar smiled again, and then he moved, faster than Varian expected. Faster than anyone expected. His wings snapped open, no longer weak, no longer bound by pain. He lunged, his claws meeting Varian's with a force that cracked the earth beneath them. Varian's eyes widened, just for a second, before he snarled, locking against Nixar in a vicious clash of power. Nixar's voice was steady, fierce, unshaken. "I am no longer the runt you abandoned." Varian's snarl twisted into something like rage. "Then prove it." Elias took a step back, grinning. "Oh, this is going to be good." And as the fight began, as fire met fury, as two dragons clashed beneath the endless sky, Nixar knew he would never be small again. Nixar's body slammed into the canyon wall, stone shattering beneath his weight. A sharp gasp tore from his throat, pain rippling through his wings as he struggled to right himself. Varian loomed before him, a towering shadow of obsidian scales and cruel strength, his silver eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "You've grown defiant," Varian mused, stepping forward, claws digging into the cracked earth. "But defiance does not make you strong." Nixar gritted his teeth, forcing his body to move, his talons scraping against the canyon floor as he pulled himself up. Every muscle ached, but he was still standing. That was more than Varian had expected of him. A flicker of fire built in his chest, hot and insistent, burning against the memory of his exile, against the pain of being cast aside like nothing. "I survived," Nixar growled, his golden eyes blazing. "That makes me stronger than you'll ever be." Varian's lips curled in a snarl. "You survived because we let you." He lunged, his massive form blurring with speed, claws tearing through the air toward Nixar's throat. But this time, Nixar was ready. He sidestepped, twisting his body at the last second, and for the first time, Varian missed. Before the older dragon could recover, Nixar struck, his claws raking across Varian's side, drawing blood. Varian roared, staggering back, eyes wide with disbelief. He touched the wound as if he couldn't fathom the idea that Nixar, the runt, the weakling, the failure, had drawn first blood. Elias, watching from the sidelines, grinned. "Now that's what I like to see." Nixar felt the shift. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving. He wasn't just enduring. He was winning. Varian's gaze darkened. His pride would not allow this. He reared back, his chest expanding, the telltale glow of gathering fire burning behind his teeth. Elias swore under his breath. "Oh, that's not good." Nixar saw it coming, but he didn't run. The old Nixar, the one they had left in the dust, might have cowered, might have hesitated, but he was not that dragon anymore. He lowered himself, wings snapping open, gathering his own strength deep in his chest. If Varian wanted a firestorm, he would get one. They released their flames at the same time. Varian's fire was an inferno, a wave of blistering, white-hot energy that consumed everything in its path. But Nixar's was different. His fire was pure heat, pure force, a concentrated jet of blue plasma, honed not by raw strength, but by precision. His breath pierced through Varian's, cutting straight through the inferno, splitting the older dragon's attack apart like a blade through cloth. And then Nixar was there, inside Varian's guard, moving before the elder dragon could recover. He slammed his claws into Varian's chest, forcing the larger dragon back, wings beating against the wind as he drove his opponent down, down, down. The earth shook as Varian's body crashed into the ground. The silence that followed was deafening. Nixar landed softly, panting, smoke curling from his lips. He waited, watching as Varian's chest rose and fell, the older dragon blinking up at the sky, dazed. Slowly, Varian turned his head, meeting Nixar's gaze. And for the first time, there was no hatred there, only acceptance. "You are not weak," Varian admitted, his voice hoarse. "Not anymore." Nixar exhaled sharply, something easing in his chest. "I never was." Varian closed his eyes briefly, as if acknowledging the truth of it. Then, with great effort, he rolled onto his feet, bowing his head just slightly, a gesture of respect he had never before offered Nixar. Elias let out a low whistle. "Well, damn, didn't see that coming." Nixar straightened, feeling something shift within him, something that had long been broken, now mending. He had won, not just the battle, but his place, and no one would take it from him again. Varian and his forces departed at dawn. No more threats, no more battles, just a quiet understanding that the runt they had cast aside was no longer theirs to discard. Elias watched them go, arms crossed, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Told you," he said. Nixar snorted. "Told me what?" Elias glanced at him. "That you weren't done yet." Nixar considered that, then looked up at the sky, the same sky he had once thought he would never reach again. It was his now. "I think it's time we leave this place," Nixar murmured. Elias raised a brow. "We?" The dragon tilted his head, golden eyes gleaming. "Unless you intend to return to your life without me?" Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "Not a chance. You're the most interesting thing that's ever happened to me." Nixar smirked, then turned toward the Aurora Dawn, the human's ship. He stretched his wings once, testing the wind, the weight of them finally feeling like his own. This time, when he leapt, he did not fall. His wings caught the wind, lifting him higher, higher, until he was soaring over the canyon, the world small beneath him, his body light, free. Elias whooped from the ground, grinning up at him. "There you go, little guy." Nixar swooped low, deliberately close enough that the wind from his wings nearly knocked Elias over. "I am not little," he called, amused. Elias laughed. Yeah, I guess not anymore." Nixar flew higher, drinking in the feeling of the open air, the limitless sky stretching out before him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't bound to the expectations of others, to the weight of exile and shame. He was Nixar. No longer an abandoned mistake, no longer a forgotten name, but a dragon worth remembering, and the galaxy would soon know it.